assassination has never changed the history of the world. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. While Disraeli may have been quite highly regarded by Queen Victoria, I'm pretty sure this particular quote makes many who look at history shake their head in confusion. The assassination of King Philip of Macedon and Alexander's young age upon coming to the throne definitely changed history. Julius Caesar, King William II of England, Shaka Zulu, Abraham Lincoln, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The list is long and illustrious, and in many cases, downright soaked in tragedy. Since the invention of flight, a new form of assassination has hurtled onto the world stage: the crash of an airline or helicopter flight. It's a particularly useful method of assassination. The extreme trauma of bodies that fall from the sky, explode, or crash into terrain makes identifying pre-existing trauma difficult. If this method is chosen, it can be an obvious assassination, as in the case of Juvenal Habyarimana of Rwanda, or it can be a more nebulous, did they or didn't they question. Both methods have their uses in sending a message. The assassination by airplane has become enough of a trope that dictators the world over have exhibited a marked preference for internal travel by train, a mode of transportation far less fraught with opportunity to fall out of the sky. And it is a method that, once again, at the end of August 2023, is front and center in the news cycle. One of the most obvious aerial assassinations in recent decades took place on April 6, 1994, when the flight carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down with 2 surface-to-air missiles while getting ready to land in Kigali, Rwanda. This assassination was the starting shot to the Rwandan genocide, which resulted in the deaths of more than 800,000 Rwandan Tutsis and sympathizers. President Habyarimana had been warned against this particular flight by none other than Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, who managed to obtain Habyarimana's remains sometime after the accident and inter them in a vault at his Versailles in the Jungle Palace. When Sese Seko himself had to flee Zaire, Habyarimana's remains were cremated under the supervision of a Hindu leader and buried. Habyarimana was Catholic. Far more controversial is the crash that killed UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld just outside of Ndola in what is now Zambia in 1961. As with the 1994 shoot-down of the presidential plane in Rwanda, Mobutu Sese Seko, then still known as Joseph Désiré Mobutu, was involved in this sordid story. Hammarskjöld was flying to the Congo in an attempt to negotiate a peace agreement between rival factions. The Congo crisis had begun just 5 days after Congolese independence in 1960, and the fighting, assassinations, evacuations, and general descent into chaos threatened to spread. Hammarskjöld, as Secretary General, had sent UN troops to the Congo but refused to let them be used for internal political matters. As a result, when Patrice Lumumba was tortured and murdered in January 1961, the Eastern Bloc nations, along with Yugoslavia and socialists throughout the world, blamed Hammarskjöld. Initially and officially, Hammarskjöld's flight was deemed an accident by the Rhodesian Board of Investigation, but others pointed out that the report issued ignored many salient facts, including witness reports of a flash of light in the sky where the plane was located just before its crash. Several other investigations have taken place, including a UN inquiry in 1962 that stated it could not rule out sabotage or attack. Yet another investigation in 2017 came closer to an admission of assassination, stating, "It appears plausible that an external attack or threat may have been a cause of the crash, whether by way of direct attack or by causing a momentary distraction of the pilots." The Congo crisis certainly contained reasons for wanting to stymie peace, most notably among them the mining interests in breakaway provinces. But there hasn't been definitive proof that the third Secretary General of the United Nations was assassinated. The early 1940s was a boom time for aircraft assassinations, and one nation in particular seemed very enamored of the new killer technology. In 1941, a plane carrying the Finnish Red Army officer Toivo Atikanen crashed near Arkhangelsk. Atikanen had been a Soviet hero during the Winter War with Finland and had carried out numerous espionage and sabotage activities on Finnish soil. He even spent time in a Finnish prison for his activities on behalf of the Soviet Union. But it all changed when he was deported back to the Soviet Union in 1940 and found that his communist Finnish associates were all missing. Uncovering that they had been victims of the Great Purge, Antikanen's belief in the communist system wavered. After a mental collapse, he began pointedly asking questions, something which Soviet-era military officers knew very well not to do. One story of Antikanen's demise has him jumping out of a window as the NKVD were knocking down his door. Other stories have Yuri Andropov directly involved, but while the plane carrying Atikanen definitely crashed, few believe that it was an accident. Another terrible example of asking questions as a cause of an airline disaster can possibly be found in the Polish Prime Minister in exile Vladislav Sikorski in 1943 near Gibraltar. Sikorski was a decorated Polish war hero and a charismatic yet pragmatic leader in exile who was attempting to open up dialogue with the Soviet Union, even after their invasion of Poland in 1939. That all changed when the news of the Katyn massacre became public, and Sikorski began demanding answers. The German army, pushing into the Soviet Union, had found mass graves of more than 20,000 Polish leaders and officers. These were the young leaders of Polish society, and if what the Nazis were saying was true, they had been murdered by the Soviets. Soviet attempts at explanations fell flat, and the evidence on the scene showed the terrible truth of a systematic murder of Poland's best and brightest. Sikorski demanded investigations. The Soviet Union did not respond, and they didn't respond well. Multiple investigations showed that Sikorski's wounds were consistent with crash trauma, but none of the investigations could rule out any form of sabotage. Sikorski's questions about Katyn were ones the Soviets did not want asked, and history has been very clear about the fate of asking questions in the Soviet Union. Sikorski's death was a massive setback for Polish independence after World War II. Of course, the Soviet Union, while a frequent perpetrator of aircraft assassination, was not the only nation utilizing this resource. In 1971, the decorated Chinese marshal and supporter of Mao Zedong, Lin Bao, died in Mongolia when his aircraft crashed, supposedly due to pilot error. The Chinese government immediately declared that Lin Bao had been fleeing to the Soviet Union after losing the trust of Mao and planning a coup to usurp him. As it crashed on Soviet soil, they handled the investigation. And while they released a finding of pilot error and confirmed that they had identified Lin Bao, any records of interviews with Chinese officials or others possibly involved were intentionally destroyed by the Politburo, with the exception of the heads of Lin Bao and another passenger named Yi Cheng. Western scholars attempted an investigation in 1994 and found numerous discrepancies in the Chinese and Soviet timelines and reporting, but further confirmation was impossible. Lin Bao's image was censored, so for many years in China, as Zhou Enlai moved blame from the Cultural Revolution excesses to him, but he has lately been at least partially rehabilitated. Lin Bao's head is still held in the Russian archives. By the 1980s, airline hijackings had decreased in incidence, although due to mass media news coverage, Many of us in Generation X will tell you that it seemed as though hijackings were a terrifying, constant threat. Airline assassinations were still happening as well, and some organizations were more than happy to take credit when they did. On the 1st of June 1987, Lebanese Prime Minister Rasheed Kurami was on his way to Beirut when a bomb placed under his helicopter seat exploded, killing him instantly. Although others in the helicopter were wounded in the explosion, Kurami was the only fatality. Kurami had served as the Lebanese Prime Minister an astounding 8 times from 1959 to 1987. He was politically well-connected, and although he often had disputes with Lebanese presidents, he was also everyone's first choice in handling a crisis. A little over 1 year after Kurami's assassination, the president of Pakistan, Mohamed Zia was killed in a plane crash in Punjab. On board with him were several Pakistani government officials, as well as the American ambassador to Pakistan and the U.S. general in charge of the military aid mission to Pakistan. Zia had come to power in a military coup that imprisoned and then executed former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and his reign, supported by the United States as a bulwark against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was known for suppressing the press and instituting harsh measures for morality crimes. Flogging became widespread as a punishment for crimes, real and imagined. Stoning and amputation were reintroduced, and premarital sex for women was outlawed. Zia was instrumental in arming Islamic fundamentalists to fight against communist incursion. According to U.S. Representative Charlie Wilson, he was instrumental in defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan. And, of course, Zia had no shortage of enemies. While the American investigation found the issue causing the crash was mechanical, the Pakistani investigation had more sinister conclusions. The crash was a result of sabotage. A hard suspect was never named, but theories range from the Soviets to the U.S. to the Bhutto family in retaliation for the execution of Zulfikar Bhutto and the subsequent mysterious death of his son. Assassination by aircraft is just another in a long line of methods used to get rid of the troublesome, the terrible, and the tragic. Past serial assassins would probably have thrilled to the idea of a method that provided so much deniability and disruption of evidence, precisely the reason that it remains in use today. But, as always, our short discussions should just be a starting point. There is far more to be read and understood about the history of assassination, as well as each of the specific incidents we've discussed today. Please read more, go back further, and for goodness sake, make sure you can find these places on a map.